My pussy is like my biggest ally right now, because she's like, if I don't feel that devotional presence, this is a no-fly zone. Like, don't even try.
From the bed, turn the spark to a fire. Horizontal with Lila. Horizontal with Lila. Horizontal with Lila. Horizontal with Lila.
I'm Lila, and I am horizontal in Canggu, Bali, Indonesia.
And I'm Kelsey, and I'm horizontal in Vancouver, BC.
Hello, horizontal lover. Horizontal is the podcast about intimacy of all kinds, recorded while lying down. You're listening to Season 4, my season of experiments. During this season, I'm playing with form and format, length and structure, context and content. I'll be including mashups with other podcasts, themed episodes, crossovers, shows with segments, among other things. Unlike the first 3 seasons, most of Season 4 will be recorded remotely, so I'm often horizontal across the world from my guest, which is a grand experiment in itself. This is part 3 of my 4-episode arc with Kelsey Grant, love educator, boundaries expert, writer, singer, witchy woman, and creatrix of various kinds, known on Instagram as Radical Self-Love. Usually my horizontal recording sessions are between 3 and 5 hours long and divided into 2 parts if 3 hours or 4 parts if 5. The first installment, or the first 2 installments, are available in all the podcast places for all horizontalists, and the second half, or the latter 2 parts, are available exclusively to patrons of the horizontal arts. One of my experiments with Kelsey's arc is to divvy things up a bit differently. In this case, my first and third episode with Kelsey, which are episodes 116 and this installment, 118, are available to everyone, and the second and fourth are available exclusively to patrons. There's also a bonus sort of grab bag stream of consciousness episode we recorded that I'm considering releasing either in full as a bonus episode for patrons or also in 2 parts. To be determined, horizontal lovers. For access to the full horizontal, which includes all the part 2s, or in this case, 2s and 4s, going back to the beginning, become a patron of the Horizontal Arts by navigating directly to patreon.com/horizontalwithlila. That is spelled patreon.com/horizontalwithlila. Use that link precisely because creators dubbed adult are actually hidden by Patreon's search engine, so you can't find me if you type into the search box. When you become a patron, I also send you a personal thank you video with a happy dance. In part 1, episode 116, Planet Friendship, which was my first episode that's almost entirely about platonic intimacy, we talked about her nourishing female friend pod and 6-month vetting process. Mother wounds, getting kicked out of the house, emotional release, resisting the codependent parental undertow, and how Kelsey and her best friend heal by reparenting each other. In part 2, episode 117, An Emotionally Safe Connection, a patron-only episode, we discussed my best friend Margay, inner circle friendship, virtual and in-person connection, the ability to hold simultaneous conflicting emotions, Harry Potter and nerding out, and the masterful, loving way Kelsey expressed her boundaries to me. In this, part 3, we deliberately got horizontal to talk about sex. We explored cervical, G-spot, and clitoral orgasms, devotional presence and the lack thereof, fantasizing about women during sex, self-reverence, and Kelsey's sexual evolution from getting kicked out of the house to her huntress phase, to exploration with a virgin, to going off the pill, to kink, to cervical orgasms and betrayal, to self-exploration and crystal dildos. Come lie down with us again in Canggu, Bali, Indonesia, and Vancouver, BC, Canada. I admit to feeling kind of stormy and gray. I'm PMSing. I'm feeling lonely. I feel that great disappointment of that man kind of opening me up and then stepping all the way away.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
But I think as we get amongst it, I will enliven. So, Kelsey.
Hi.
Hi. What did you learn about sex growing up?
I mean, my first impulse is to say not much.
Common.
What does stand out is there was more of a clinical education in our household. Like, it was very practical. Like, I knew from a very young age that babies were birthed through the vaginal canal. They did not come out of the tummy. Like, and I honestly don't even know how I knew that. When I was approaching becoming a teenager, Sunday nights were like sex education in our house. So
really?
She had this series, this video series that we would have to watch every Sunday night and talk about it. You know, at the time, I think that was quite progressive for growing up I'm an 80s baby, so that would have been in the 90s. And the resources were very, very clinical. Like, this is a vagina and this is a penis. And so I had a clinical understanding of my anatomy, but not so much any real education around sex and intimacy. So the education around that was more of my conditioning from the Catholic Church, which is no sex till marriage. You have sex to make babies, and that's pretty much it. And then I also remember this coin collector thing my dad had in his closet. One column was nights that you asked for sex and got it. And then the other column was nights that you asked for sex and you didn't get it. And the column where like you asked for sex and you didn't get it was always so full. And like that is like so burned in my psyche. And I'm like, wow. Oh, I guess like sex isn't really a thing that you do to enjoy, and like it's more, you know, the masculine pursuing it and the feminine shutting it down. And so, I mean, that paired with all of the conditioning from the church made it really confusing. And I also remember having a lot of sexual energy, and I mean, I still do. Like having all of those feelings and impulses and not really knowing what to do with it. And, you know, that was a bit tricky. And in a Catholic school, we definitely weren't getting a lot of sex education. We did have a condom demonstration in 7th grade.
Banana.
On a banana, yep. Which in a Catholic school is like really unheard of.
That is impressive.
Our friend's mom really advocated for it, and she came in and did the sex education class where she went to every single classroom and showed them how to use a condom.
Was your friend embarrassed, do you think?
Very. Because she had a son who was in my grade, but she also had a son who was in my brother's grade, so both of them were just mortified that this was happening, and their mom was the sex educator for our junior high school.
Oh, wow. There's that show, Sex Education, on Netflix, right? Where the guy's the boy's the son of a sexologist, and he is just, but then he turns into a kind of an armchair sexologist at school.
So good.
But consistent mortification is a theme. Because you're not supposed to have that. There's not supposed to be ease there, right? In the cultural narrative, it isn't comfortable to talk with your parents about sex.
Yeah, it's one of those very awkward situations, and I know I would get so embarrassed every time my mom would pull out one of the VHSs for our Sunday evening education. I'm like, oh, I don't want to talk about this with my mom. But to talk to my friends' moms, that was totally fine. Like, I had no weird feelings about talking and asking questions to different adults. It was just my parents, and from
your adults,
what I understand, yeah, my adults. Like, and I feel like that's pretty normal, at least in the women that I am close with, and also all the women that I've worked with. That seems to be a very common experience.
But why does it have to be that way? I think it is quite universal, and it's joked about all the time. And, there's tons of scenes in movies where the child is absolutely mortified because the parent is talking about sex. But why should it be that way? Mm-hmm. That's how we got here, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I imagine, a lot of it has to do with our own sexual shame and any trauma that we might be storing. And, as I'm obviously not a parent, but I could imagine that if I hadn't met those parts of myself and really welcomed them home, that I might have a sense of feeling weird about talking about my sexuality with my child. And then if I had really gone through that integration and it felt safe in my body, and I was really in a place of expanded, anchored pleasure in that arena of my life, that it would feel more normal and natural to have these discussions. I think it's the shame that really distorts it and brings up those feelings of embarrassment, because how parents talk about sex can also be really awkward sometimes.
Right.
And instead of, hey, this is just a normal part of being human. Your body is designed to feel pleasurable, and we're just going to teach you how that works and teach appropriate boundaries and consent and all of these really important things. And if the family system itself isn't operating from that place of shame, I think it is just more normalized, and there is freedom to ask questions without those strange feelings or feeling embarrassed and kind of overloaded by that conversation.
How did you learn about pleasure? Was it from those Sunday night VHS tapes?
No. There was like zero pleasure in those VHS tapes. I learned about it there in Canada. There used to be this radio show on Sunday nights. I guess Sunday night was just the night.
Sex night.
It was called the Sunday Night Sex Show with Sue. And it was on one of the radio stations. And so after I would go to bed, I would turn on my radio really, really quietly. And I would listen to the sex show with Sue. And I would listen to her answer callers' questions and talk about sex in this really open and pleasure-filled way. Like, she was all about the pleasure and all about proper education and bringing pleasure and sex out of the shadow. I don't know that she would have used those exact words, but that's how it makes sense to me now, looking back on it, that she was such a sex positive role model. And that's really where I started to learn about sex and pleasure from this very empowered place. Although it was also hidden because I had to listen to it in secret. And
this is Canadian radio?
Yes.
Because I have never heard of the sex show with Sue.
Yeah. Yeah, it was in, I guess it was the 90s that I would have been listening to this. It was about grade 7 that I started listening to that radio show. And so I don't know what age, I'm terrible with ages and grades, and but I think that's around like 12 or 13. She was on the air for a long time, and I think the only reason she's probably not on the air is because she maybe retired, because she was an older lady, and that was also really cool to me. I'm like, here's this like granny talking about sex and pleasure. I'm like, this is amazing. And it really anchored in my psyche that, you know, even as we age, even as we develop, we can still have pleasure. Pleasure isn't capped at our 20s or 30s or 40s. Like, here's a woman, and at the time she was in her late 60s, early 70s.
Wow,
and she
amazing.
was still talking about pleasure and sex from such an empowered place.
Thank goodness, right? Because that's another huge butt of jokes, is people having sex when they're older. But hello, do you want to stop having sex? I mean, don't you want pleasure to continue throughout your life? Like, why should that be so odd or so funny? There's a huge renaissance of sexual expression in nursing homes, and that is considered hilarious and ridiculous. But why not? There's all this leisure time. There's probably less worry about society's bullshit. And there's just hopefully the intention to enjoy the rest of your days. And what could be more enjoyable but a focus on sensuality and pleasure? I mean,
yes.
Come on.
That is the kind of nursing home I want to be put in when I'm in my later days. Thank you very much. Sign me up.
Yes. So Kelsey is a sensualist.
I mean, I really do. I mean, my senses are so much a part of my pleasure map and my pleasure experience. Like, things need to feel really good. They need to smell good and to look good. All of the things. And that just drops me down into a deeper space of receptivity of pleasure. And that has been an exploration for a large majority of my sexual life, of really learning how to play with the sensory experience and get into my body and explore what does feel good to all of my senses, what feels good to my body. Once I have more of that data, it's so much easier to welcome someone else into that vortex with me.
My favorite kink is sensation play. And an alternating series of surprises, a dance with tempo and duration and pressure. I love to experience the pinwheel and then a soft caress and then my hair being pulled and then a spill of hot wax and then a squeezing of my butt and then, you know, a scratching. I just love to have a buffet of sensory experiences. That is my favorite. That is the way in which I am the most kinky, really. So I'm interested in impact play, but not of its own, not just necessarily for the impact. You know, after the spanking, I want other things. I want other sensations. Yeah.
My body's just getting fully turned on listening to your turn on. I love this so much. My body's like, that's delish. I really love the tease.
Oh, yeah.
The tease is so good. And you know what I hear you saying with kind of the variety of sensation play, I'm like, gosh, that would keep my need for variety so well satiated. Just everything that you were describing. I'm like, all of it.
And then it's easier for me to stay in it, right?
Right.
When someone, for instance, you're cuddling with someone and maybe your attention is elsewhere, like on a TV show or something, and they are sort of absent-mindedly stroking your arm up and down and up and down and up and down. I usually push their hand away. because it starts to actually chafe my skin. And the same touch done with intention, maybe a different speed, maybe a bit slower, could be pleasurable for a certain amount of time. But because it is so unconscious, it starts to feel gross. Like, I don't want it. And I wind up taking their hand off of my body. I want to be touched with presence.
That devotional presence is a really important precursor for me too. And I know the exact sensation that you were talking about. Like, it's almost like my arm can feel being rubbed raw from that lack of intention. And it's just like, it's like the same spot over and over and over. I'm like, stop it.
Yes. Yeah. Get off. Get off.
Stop. It hurts. Enough.
Yeah, and it's almost itchy and it's almost chafing, and it's like, ugh.
It's the opposite of what feels pleasurable to me in my body. And that presence piece, I think, is so key. Like, because I do have a strong intuitive energy, like, I can feel when someone disconnects. I can feel when they're not there with me. And that is not a turn on for me at all. If I'm going to go into this domain with you, I need to feel you anchored in yourself, and I need to feel the devotional presence, because that's what I'm bringing. I'm bringing my embodiment. I'm bringing my full presence, my full devotion. To not be met in that feels gutting, to be honest, and really does not turn on my system. And my pussy's got to the point where she's like, yeah, no entry. She will just deny entry if there is not that devotional presence. She's like, nope, we're not playing today. And I'm like, oh, all right, we're allies here. This is fantastic. It's taken a while to get to that point of reverence and connection and attunement within my own system, and knowing that that's what I require from a partner. An important key to my turn on. It has been a process through my sexual reclamation and exploration, but to really have someone be anchored in their body and fully present with me is something that completely revs my system, turns me on, because that's the level of intentionality that I'm bringing to the mix. And to me, sexual energy is so sacred in so many ways, and it requires that reverence of being present. There's so many beautiful elements to explore, and like cosmic orgasms and all of the sensation play, like all of that is available when there is this devotional reverence and it's being met from all people involved. And so for me, that has been such a huge piece. And my pussy is like my biggest ally right now, because she's like, if I don't feel that devotional presence, this is a no-fly zone. Like, don't even try. Like, I feel like it's that, is it Harry? No, it's not Harry Potter. It's Lord of the Rings, where it's like crashing the staff on the ground and being like, you shall not pass.
Thou shalt
like, that
not
is
pass.
Yes. Like, that is what my pussy does now when there is no reverence, when there is no devotional presence, when it is that like mindless, I'm just like rubbing her arm because I'm like, oh, I got to do that thing, and then that'll turn her on. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not it. No, it's not happening. Let's turn on the devotional presence, and then we can see where we go from there.
Can you tell if someone is fantasizing?
I mean, I learned that a lot in my last relationship. I could feel him disconnect, and especially in sex, and I would have to be like, hey, where did you go? Not that fantasy is a bad thing, but for me, I'm like, if we don't have an agreement that we're going to go off into the recesses of our own minds, that can feel like I'm being dropped. And so when I feel that in an intimate setting, like, then my body again closes. And if I've been really wet up until that point, it's like a fucking desert, almost instantaneously.
Wow.
Like, my pussy is so fucking magical. And she just knows what's up. Like, the split second of disconnect, she'll know. And what I'm coming to really, really learn is to be in tandem with her and call it out in the moment. Like, hey, where'd you go? Or, hey, let's slow down. Let's take a few breaths together and reconnect. Just so that I feel safe to open. Because when my partner is off somewhere else, that does not feel safe in my body to open to him. I want to be penetrated by this cosmic energy of sacred reverence and presence. And that can't happen if he is not fully in the experience with me, if he's off in his mind having a different experience. So to answer your question, yeah, I can feel it when that disconnect happens. And it's a very visceral feeling in my body. My body's not fucking around anymore. It's like, we've got some pleasure to experience, and like
literally
this bar and this standard is high, and we aren't settling for anything less than this juiciness and this devotional presence that is totally available and totally possible.
I admit to fantasizing in order to come most of the time. And so if somebody was like, where'd you go? I would definitely experience it as a slap on the wrist.
For sure. That was definitely me for so long. Like, it was always like a key for me. I'm like, if I'm fantasizing about someone else and I'm not present here, like, is there something that I'm missing? Not always, but like, is there something going on in this connection that I'm not fully attuned to? And if I really addressed it, that would maybe change my reality a little bit. Because I've noticed in every relationship where I've gotten to that threshold of like, we've gone as far as we can go, that's when I'll start fantasizing. And for me, it's using a lot of imagery and fantasy around being with another woman. So I'll literally fantasize about being with a woman while being penetrated by my partner.
Yeah, mine always adds a woman.
And I mean, for me, I love that. Like, it's so sensual and like being connected to the feminine in that way. And in some pockets of my life, it's because I have totally disowned my feminine and I'm really fractured from her. And in other times, I'm like, I think I just need to explore my attraction to women and just own it at this point in time. And other times, like, it can be a bridge to deeper intimacy with a partner that I've looped in to that fantasy loop. So, I mean, it's served many different purposes. And I find, like, when I'm with a partner now and it's a really aligned connection, I want to be consumed by that experience. I won't want to disconnect unless my intimacy issues start to flare up. And I'm like, ooh, this is getting too deep. This is getting too close. Like, this is getting too vulnerable. And then that's when I might fracture off and like slip into fantasy. But I mean, that's just me. That's not a universal thing that is true for everybody. So that's just what I've noticed within myself and my own patterns with it.
Oftentimes for me, it was, I didn't feel I was going to get there with what was in front of me. Right. And I needed the extra stimulation of my eroticized threesome in my brain. And then there were some partners that I did loop in to the fantasy so that I wasn't having a separate experience from them. So I shared what was in my brain with them so that we were then having the same experience. Or, you know, not the same experience, but we were in the scene together. And that could be incredibly hot. That could be really delightful. I definitely don't want that to be my go-to, though.
Right.
I mean, it's challenging enough for me to find a man I want to have sex with, who wants to have sex with me, who's at liberty to do so at this point in time. And it's like, you know, and then I have had a few sensual sexual encounters recently. They've certainly not been full of devotional presence, you know? And then my friend Linnea, who's a dating coach in Sweden, she was saying, I totally get it. It's tricky. It's tricky to choose between something and nothing when everything isn't available.
Right. Makes so much sense. So much sense.
Because at a certain point, you know, it had been, I hadn't had sex in 11 months. And I still haven't had penetrative penis and vagina sex. And my body is hungry, just as I'm hungry for other kinds of connection and intimacy. I have that skin hunger and sex hunger.
I feel you. It's been 7 or 8 months since I've had sex as well, and I'm starting to feel that impulse, that hunger start to rev up. It's not like real intense yet, but it's starting to come back. I'm like, this is a very unprecedented time in life. I'm like, how am I going to navigate this? Like when it comes to like full blown hunger, I'm like, oh, this is going to be an interesting pocket of my life to navigate. That's for sure.
I think many of us will settle because we're so hungry that gourmet doesn't seem available. And we don't want to hold out because our bodies want to live and come alive and be touched and touch, you know? And so we'll have the occasional fast food.
Yeah, it's a dilemma to be in this for sure. Because it is just like eating fast food. I'm like, okay, I'm starving. I know that after I eat this, you know, McDonald's, I'm going to feel like a bag of shit. But I'm so hungry, and like all of the chemicals in the food like make me think that it's like so delicious. But like there's an impact a few days later when it fucks my digestive system and I can't have a bowel movement and I haven't received any actual nutrients from it. So I think that'll be like an interesting line for me to have to walk as I go through the process of, you know, being single in a pandemic.
Right. Well, with McDonald's for certain, but it isn't always so black and white, right? I had an experience that was not wholly delicious in itself in the moment, mostly not feeling very connected, which I did presence and I did say, and then there was a shift towards the end of the experience. But mostly I didn't feel very connected. I would not say I felt like shit when I went home or the next day. I felt a bit hollow. Would it have been better not to have that experience? I actually don't think so. Devotional presence was certainly not available to me that day. I actually want to know what your definition is, or how you think of devotional presence, because I think that might feel very nebulous to people.
The first place the devotional presence starts is in the relationship to self. So if I notice that someone isn't really present with their full experience of themselves, there's something in my system that just knows the level of presence that they can bring to themselves, to their internal world, to their shadow, to all that is within them, is the same, to a degree, is the same level of devotional presence that they can bring inside a sexual union or a relational union. And for me, it requires the ability to connect to those sticky, gnarly parts of who we are and bring them forward out of the shadow and into the light. And so if I know that someone has the capacity to do that, and they show that through their actions, there's a humility there. There's the capacity to take accountability and responsibility for themselves in their life, there is a reverence to their own experience of being human that is being embodied. And to me, that reverence of their own relationship to self then gets translated into how present can they be with me. And so in sexual union, it's being attuned enough to my energy field so that when there are those micro shifts, that they don't go unnoticed. It's that moment of like, hey, where'd you go? And not from a shaming place, but just like, hey, just checking in. Like, does this feel good? If I'm sensing that maybe you'd like something else. And, that goes both ways. So being able to read each other's energy in the bedroom and notice those subtle shifts that happen when we go from connection to disconnection, connection to disconnection. Because we're not going to stay totally present, totally connected 100% of the time. I wouldn't even put that, standard on myself or another person.
Exhausting,
but it's
impossible.
more so like, yeah, it's impossible. But it's more so like flowing with that experience and not stepping over it and saying, hey, I just noticed a shift here. Do we need to try something else? Do you want to go into the bubble bath? Like, let's play. And so it becomes more of an exploration. And I find, like, if I think about children, like how present they are on a playground, they're exploring the full range of that playground because they're present. If they're not present, they're going to fall off the jungle gym. That same level of presence, if we bring it into the bedroom, like we have now unlocked this storehouse of play and pleasure that we can really get into, like the nuance, the nitty gritty, like these corners of our sexual pleasure and desire that maybe we've never felt safe enough to unlock. And for me, when someone is able to tune in to those subtle energy shifts with me, then my body gets cued like, hey, this person can hold down the fort. This person is attuned enough that they can root, they can be a safe place for you to melt and surrender into. And vice versa, that works on both sides. So it's a nice trust builder so that we have trust that gets activated so that surrender and deeper pleasure and deeper desire can really start to come to the surface. That's how it makes sense to me.
You said you think it begins with self-reverence.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
In the simplest way, it's the process of knowing ourselves and knowing like the tricks that our little trickster has in their pocket. And we know what our strengths are. We know where we might not be the strongest or we might have weaknesses. And we're able to hold all of those parts, not try and diminish certain parts or pretend they don't exist, but it's a welcoming of all the parts of who we are. That's a process. I mean, that's my whole body of work. It's like this process of cultivating that reverent connection, you with you, getting to know these parts of yourself that maybe you've been at war with for your whole life, or maybe have been repressed or in the shadow or not safe to touch. And so as we get to know the fuller picture of who we are, both shadow and light and everything in between, there is a capacity that gets built to be able to hold the complexity of another human being when we're connected to our own complexity. There's so much out there that just minimizes the human experience and tries to like break it down into like these super simple digestible nuggets, but in reality, like human beings are complex as fuck, and no two people are the same. No two people have the same history or the same experiences, and to be able to hold the fullness of your human incarnation, your human experience, is the groundwork for dropping into these deeper layers of devotion that can be available through our sexual expression.
There's something in here that I want to pull out, though. about, the widely touted piece of bullshit, you can't love anybody until you love yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm hoping people don't take away from what you just said.
100%. 100%.
You're not possible to have devotional presence without having self-reverence, because so many people are struggling with parts of themselves and accepting their wholeness and accepting their shadow parts. And I don't think that means that they can't be really alive and present with a lover.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, like, I'm looking at it through the lens of longer term partnership. And, in order to sustain that long term in a partnership, when our shadow is going to get triggered and when all of these parts are going to come out to dance, there has to be an ability to sit with yourself in that material. And sometimes sitting with yourself in that material means inviting other people in to witness you and to hold you and to support you. But in terms of, having a lover or a shorter term relationship, I can definitely be present for an hour. Doesn't mean that I have the capacity to be present more consistently in a relational container. And I've noticed the correlation for me, the more I do connect to those parts of me, the more I expand my capacity to be consistent in a longer term relationship. But yeah, that whole adage of like, you have to love yourself before you can love another person is not actually true, because a lot of us are capable of loving other people, but we don't love ourselves.
Definitely.
And there's, yeah.
And 100%. How did we learn? How did we learn how to love?
Yeah, in relationship. At least for me, some of my greatest learning of self-love has come through relationships, whether those were friendships or in family or in romantic partnership. I've even had lovers who I wasn't, in a committed relationship with, but those lovers, the way that they were able to show up for whatever pocket of time we spent together was so deeply healing. And that presence was able to help me unlock deeper layers. So we could get stuck in a bind, in a loop forever, debating which comes first, the chicken or the egg. But they're both important, and sometimes having these contrasting experiences where someone isn't devotionally present gives us a lot more clarity of what that means to us. And then we have moments where we connect with a part of ourselves that we've had a hard time holding. And then that expands our ability to be with other people's shadowy bits or their wholeness. So it all kind of fits together more like in a spiral where it's like constantly moving and shifting. Like it's not this linear thing of like, do this, step one, do this, step two. Like all the steps are happening at the same time in different order, and that can be a bit of a mind fuck for people too. For me, it's just, I come from my own personal experience, which won't be the experience of everybody, but that is something that I have noticed has helped. It's that whole relationship, me with me. And I was obviously loving people before I stepped into really putting a focus on self-love. 100% I was loving people. And the level of depth that I can now go to has shifted. So the depth of that love has shifted, the more reverence I generate within myself towards myself.
How can you characterize that depth or the difference of that depth?
It feels wider and it feels deeper in terms of what I allow people to know about me. So back in my 20s, I was very performative, and a lot of my intimate relationships, like I would only let them go so far. I'd only let them go so deep in terms of knowing me and knowing the tender, vulnerable parts of me. And so now, because so much of that has been ruptured and opened and expanded, I'm able to allow people in to those stickier parts of me. Allow them in to see my vulnerabilities, to see me in like my snotty, messy cry, like howling in like so much emotional pain, or in the height of my ecstasy, or everything in between. I feel more comfortable revealing more of myself, which then brings a depth to the connection. Where I'm willing to go with myself and allow them into naturally has shifted what my experience of relationship has been. It feels like a stretching, and it feels like a bringing forward of more of who I really am, and dropping more of those masks and those performative aspects. This is what you're gonna get. And I want you to know me fully because I want to know you fully. And it feels like there's this space now for someone's humanness. Obviously, we bring our best to the table when we're first meeting someone. Like my representative is meeting your representative, and
Yeah,
we're having some board meetings here. But now it's more like I want to know the human behind the representative. I want to know the depths of who you are. Whereas before, I think there was maybe that impulse there, but there wasn't enough of a connection me with me to be able to hold whatever came forward. And now there's just greater capacity to hold whatever rises. That energy of generosity and acceptance of what is, like there's just such a richness in relating from that place. And whether that lasts a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade, a lifetime, there's this richness, there's this depth, regardless of how long the connection lasts for. And that has been incredibly nourishing to cultivate in all of the relationships I've had, specifically in the last decade. That's a big difference between my 20s and my 30s. Is this richness that has happened inside of, being okay with being seen, and that desire to be known and to know other people in their fullness.
Can you trace for me your sex life from that first experience, which was on that day that you were kicked out of your teenage home, through your relationships of consequence and into today?
Yeah, so that relationship, in terms of like my sexual expression inside of that, it was very much this compromised, contracted version of myself. Almost like there were so many power dynamics happening in that relationship where I didn't know my body. I didn't know what felt pleasurable to me. And he was someone who had a lot of experience. So I just deferred my pleasure to him. Like, you tell me what is pleasurable. And after that relationship, I had a series of lovers. And it's almost like that power dynamic flipped, where I had felt so vulnerable in that position, where I was like, nah, I'm the one in power now. And so it's almost like this huntress energy came out, where I'm like, I will eat you alive. And like whatever I want, I'm getting. There was like a no fucking around energy to that pocket of my life.
At that point, were you having orgasms from your interactions?
I was like, that is one of the things I will credit that origin relationship to, is that I did learn how to orgasm, and I learned that my body requires dual stimulation. So I knew right from that relationship that I couldn't necessarily orgasm from only penetration. And so I would always have clitoral stimulation. And so in that time where like really like ravaging and taking what I wanted and switching that power dynamic, I was like, I am not leaving here without an orgasm.
Yeah.
Like, I'm very clear. Very clear. And you are not done until I'm done.
Oh my God, yes. Good for you. Most of us don't learn that till our 30s.
Yeah, it was like, and now looking back, I'm like, whoa, like that was a little progressive there, you know, like I just thought that was how everybody was. As I moved into this space, I'm like, oh, okay, well, you know, I can credit that to my very first sexual experience because I did learn that about my body. And then I had a partner who was a virgin.
Ooh,
and that was a
wait. How did you learn that in your first sexual experience?
Because he was so experienced, he encouraged me to explore my body, and he encouraged me to play with my pussy and to play with my clit while we were having sex. And I only had to do that a few times for the correlation to be made in my brain. That this is how we get there. Once I learned what worked for me, then I just kept replicating it over and over and over.
Imagine how life-changing that could be for so many women if their first lover said, play with yourself, see what feels good.
In that regard, like, so grateful. Because I imagine that is not a lot of people's experience. And the very first time we even had sex, it was so slow, and he was really attuned, and like he was watching my energy, watching my eyes, and like sensing my body. So like there was a lot of consent in my very first experience. And it wasn't until we got further into our relationship where there was these shifts in power dynamics, because I was now living with him, and like I was out of my family of origin, like, and that original trauma got anchored with that very first day, and it happened a couple hours after we had had sex for the first time. So like I'd had this beautiful experience, and then it gets anchored and almost tainted with rejection from the family system. So there was that, you know, that bind of like, like this expansive pleasure, but like better watch out, something will get taken away from you. And I think that's why I went into this space of like, I am like in charge of my pleasure, and like I'll decide. Like, this sassy, fiery, spicy part of me really came out.
How did that assuage the concern that if you had pleasure, something would be taken from you?
I honestly don't even think that I made that correlation at the time. Like when all of that happened with my family, it got pushed deep, deep, deep down. I didn't even have that correlation come to my consciousness until two or 3 years ago. That my very first sexual experience had also been anchored with abandonment and betrayal. And it had been pushed so far down because I think it was so painful when that happened, and I did not have the emotional resources to deal with that and to process it. It's almost like my body just went into survival mode of like, you just have to get through this. You got to stuff it down, ignore it, push it away, whatever you need to do to get through this. And using sex in this way to almost distract myself from having to feel the rupture that had happened. So it was very, now looking back on it, I'm like, it wasn't integrated. It wasn't a conscious connection that I had made at that point in time. And, you know, it took, I mean, that happened when I was 17. And so, you know, 2-3 years ago, that would be 35, 36. So that's a significant period of time to have something like locked down, like not even on my radar that this is an influence that's playing a part in my expression. And, you know, and I think for a long time I really did use sex to avoid feeling, because it's the one area where I do feel, and the feelings are pleasurable for the most part. And so for me, it seems like there has been this trackable pattern of it's a great avoidance tool to avoid like the deeper ruptures, the deeper emotional content. You know, it's only been in like the last decade of my life where I've really been able to start unpacking some of that, because it was so deep and it was so traumatic and painful when it happened. So, I mean, there's like that really sassy, spicy phase where that just kind of got cranked. Like the dial on that got cranked. And I'm like, no one is going to hurt me ever again. And I'm just going to take what I want. And then I went back to school and I was in university, and I felt there was a bit of a softening that started to happen there. And I dated this beautiful guy in university who was a virgin. And even that experience was so incredible, because as soon as he told me, like that old kind of predator energy of me would have been like, ooh, yes, let's like convert him. And he was like, I don't want to have sex. And, yeah. Yeah. And when he told me, I was like, okay. There was this acceptance of his experience. I'm like, we don't have to do anything that you don't want to do. And if our relationship just ends up being us making out and dry humping, okay, let's roll with it. And it was in that acceptance of reality that there was enough safety eventually that got created that we did end up having sex together. And that was such a fun relationship, because there was this curiosity in him of, ooh, what can we explore next? And me with my nonstop need for variety here, I'm like, this is fantastic. We can play with all the things. And that was my first and really only experience squirting, was with him. And at the time, I had no idea that that's what was happening. And I'm like, did I just pee all over his bed? What just happened here? And, and I think this is why we need like comprehensive sex education, but more from a mentorship standpoint of like, the big sister, or the big brother, or the big sibling position of like, hey, like, this is what pleasure feels like. This is what squirting is like, and let's just talk about it. So that when it happens, for me, it was like this surrender. It was like the deepest surrender. And then my body just let go and had this like incredibly pleasurable release. I'm like, this is incredible. And so to have that really start to pivot and shift the trajectory of using my sexual energy, and like in that relationship, I had more of an experience of what making love actually was. And up until that point, that expression, making love, made me want to vomit. Like it really repulsed me. And obviously now looking back, I'm like, yep, there's my intimacy issues. There's like my fear of vulnerability. Okay. And with him, it was my first embodied experience of what that meant, because I really did love him and he really loved me. And there was this sacredness that got activated. So then that became part of my imprint going forward. After him, I had a 4-year relationship with someone who was one of my favorite sexual connections. Like our bodies really fit well together. Our style was very similar. I had orgasms every single time. This is amazing. But at that point in time, I was finishing up my degree, and this energy of my feminism was starting to come to the forefront. This passion that was getting activated for the collective, and I could see like my work was starting to come out into my awareness of what I was put on the planet to do. And so that is what caused a lot of friction in our relationship, because that was very different from the person I entered as in that relationship. And once I started shifting and changing in that relationship, our sexual chemistry started shifting. I also went off the pill during that relationship, and I honestly felt like a crazy person. And so having to navigate the changes in my cycle, the changes in my pleasure, like my body wasn't responding the same way. Like it was a bit of a mind fuck going off of the pill and learning how to sense in my body again.
How did it change?
Because I could feel things for the first time with a lot more depth than I had up until that point.
Emotionally, you mean?
Yeah, emotionally, but also physically. Like I could feel internally inside of my pussy more than I ever had before. And that was intriguing, but also frightening. I also noticed changes in terms of how wet my body would get. And normally, in my experience, getting wet was not really a problem. And now, initially going off the pill, like it really drastically shifted that. And I couldn't get wet as easily. And my arousal was different. And I had to relearn like what arouses my body now that I'm more available in my body. Because I could now feel myself more than ever before.
And when you relearned, what had shifted?
This sense of wanting something more from a relationship. Wanting something more from my sexual experiences. Almost like this desire for sacred union was starting to be birthed. And in order for that sacred union, I needed to feel like the heart connection and the compatibility of our life path. And because my life path was diverging in this more spiritual direction and his was not, that discord for me played such a role in my body's ability to be aroused and turned on. And so I started to see like, oh, there's more vetting for alignment now that I'm going to have to explore in terms of long-term partnership. That had never been on my radar before. And that came front and center. And also this desire for more oral sex. We didn't really have a lot of oral sex in that relationship. Like, he wasn't really into it. I wasn't really into it. And after I went off the pill, I started noticing like my desire expanding. Ooh, I really want to try these things and explore in these other arenas that we haven't been for the last 3 years of our relationship. The last year and a bit was when I was off the pill and I started to notice like, oh, there's more that I'm craving here. And there's a depth that I want to be penetrated by in terms of the emotional connection and the spiritual connection that can be available through sexual union. So when that relationship ended, I went on a bit of a solo quest and went traveling. I was like, I could really revisit my fiery feminine ways and like go traveling and just have a lot of like random sex and let's get that revved up. And for a little bit of time that really worked. And by a little bit of time, I mean a month. And then I was like, oh, that's not it. Having these sexual, like these new novelty experiences with new people is great, but it wasn't feeding that deeper desire that I had uncovered in that relationship. And so that's when I kind of got my life into a new pocket of alignment, and I started following the call of my intuition, and that led me to move cities, generate the friend groups that we talked about in the other episodes. And from there, I started to have these very serendipitous and magical experiences in terms of the lovers that were coming into my life. One in particular, I met randomly on a street corner. I, at the time, did not have any interest. I was like in my own little magical world. He was very persistent. He kept pursuing me and in a very respectful way. And I'm like, wow, okay. I'm like, sure, I'll come meet you. Like, we went for coffee and all of these magical synchronicities kept happening. Eventually, we went on this one date and he kissed me. And up until the kiss, I was like, he's not really my type. Mm-hmm. He's obviously a good-looking dude, but he's not my type. And then he kisses me, and literally every single cell in my body turns on. And my pussy is going fucking mental. She's like, we need this person inside of us now. I'm like, whoa, hold your horses, lady. Let's just make out a little bit more. So we made out all night, and then he came back to my house, and we had the most insane sex of my life. So connected and so delicious. And he's a Taurus, so like there was so much sensual play and very, very present, very, very devoted, just all there in the experience with me. And that was such a beautiful imprint for me to have. And every time that we got together that summer, he kept dropping us down deeper and deeper and deeper. And I felt like I could really open in my feminine in a way that I hadn't, from this place of being off the pill and like more available in my body. And so he kind of set this new bar. And I'm so grateful for him so much. And that led into another long-term relationship where he also had a very strong sexual essence. And in that relationship, that's where my kink blueprint really came online. And I'm like, whoa, there's this part of myself that I haven't ever really given myself permission to explore. And because that was totally his jam, we got to play in that domain in our relationship. That part of our relationship was really great. The rest of it was a bit of a train wreck, but
right.
Our sexual connection was so hypnotic. That is the best word to describe it. Like I felt like I was in this hypnotic trance. And it was the first time with him, it was the first time I ever had an internal orgasm without any clitoral stimulation.
Any external, yeah.
Yeah. And that was so new for me because, as I've mentioned, I would just take matters into my own hands. I'm like, this is how I get there. I know what to do, and we're getting it done. And with him, it was like this slow and sticky unfolding of really being present and locked in with someone. And it was feeling that sensation internally where I had a cervical orgasm for the first time and a G-spot orgasm for the first time without any clitoral stimulation.
Whoa, and can you tell me the difference?
The cervical orgasm was very, very deep, and it felt like as I was orgasming, it was the energy was penetrating my heart. And so it came all the way up through my cervix into my heart and then up and out through my eyes. It was wild. It was so emotional and so vulnerable because I had never been penetrated like that before. And there was a lot of love in that session that we had with each other where that happened. Leading up to the cervical orgasm was the G-spot orgasm. And those ones were just, they had a lot more richness and depth than my normal dual stimulation with my clitoris. And so with that, I was like, oh, like this is like a different sensation. It kind of felt like this wave throughout my body. And like this washing of energy that would like start in my legs and like move up my body and like kind of wave it over my head. And then with the cervical orgasm, like it was the most vulnerable I have ever felt. And it's been a challenge to get back to that place with any other partner. It was after that experience, and this is where like that pattern, that trauma pattern came, where like I'd opened to this level, and then a couple weeks later I found out that he'd been having 2 emotional and sexual affairs. And so it was like this anchoring again of like this deep opening and pleasure, and then collapsed with the trauma of betrayal and abandonment. And so my body in that moment, after I found out about all the infidelity, just closed. I noticed very, very quickly that very prowess, like sexual goddess energy just shut down. And it went dormant for a long time. Came back out a little bit right before I met my most recent partner, who's now not my partner anymore, but it started to like bubble up again, where I'm like, ooh, I'm starting to feel myself again. And then that relationship, there was a lot of codependency and overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And like when I'm overfunctioning, I'm in like this more masculine energy and this over mothering energy, which is so not fucking sexy. And so this temptress energy could not come out inside of that container. And it's been since we ended our relationship where it's now starting to come back online again. And I'm like, okay, there she is.
She's not
the
gone.
goddess is back. Thank God.
Yeah.
And like feeling that sensation and like working with the G-spot orgasm and the cervical orgasm, just me with me. That's part of my personal reclamation right now is, you know, rediscovering those experiences for myself, with myself. And then as I feel more and more open and more in a space to welcome in a partner, that will be something that I'm definitely open to exploring with a partner down the line. And for now, that's not where I'm at. And getting to rediscover these places inside of myself and inside of my sexual expression, me with me first, is such a beautiful place to be. And it feels like such a homecoming to be here now. So those are like the major trackings of my sexual story.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
You can give yourself a G-spot orgasm?
Yes. So this actually happened last week or the week before. I have this obsidian wand. And when I masturbate, I usually just use like 2 fingers on my clit and then 2 fingers inside with like a come hither motion. And I just like rub on my G-spot with my fingers. For whatever reason, that day I was like, I'm just going to use my obsidian wand. And so I'm doing like the
Which is a crystal dildo, right?
Yeah. So I'm doing my dual stimulation. And I'm like, hold on. What if I just stopped touching my clit and just used my wand with my G-spot? I wonder what would happen. And so I stopped touching my clit and I just gently massaged my G-spot with this obsidian wand. And oh my God, my nipples are getting hard right now just thinking about it. Having like the first internal orgasm, you know, without clitoral stimulation, me with me.
Oh my gosh.
It was so fucking magical. Like so magical. And I was like, oh, I want to do this again. And I noticed like that impulse, like that hunger of like, ooh, let's try that again. And I'm like, hold on, like let's just savor this for a second. Like let's just let it wash over you. And let's be with the experience of that complete devotion and like listening to my body. Like my body knew what it wanted. It knew that it did not want to be clitorally stimulated anymore. And I listened. That consent is being built again with myself of like when my body says no, I listen. And when my body says this is what I want, I'm like, okay, let's do it. Let's play. Let's explore. And yeah, that orgasm was so fucking delicious. I shared on my Instagram the other day. I was like, now my goal is nipple orgasms because for the longest time, like my breasts just don't get a lot of TLC in the sexual domain. And I'm like, if I want a partner to like be really all up in my breasts, I'm like, maybe I need to cultivate a better relationship with them.
Yeah.
doing breast massage and like nipple play. And I just got this new toy. It's very multifunctional here. And the clitoral stimulation suction, I'm like, I'm just going to use this on my nipples. And it's so good. I'm like, ooh, there's some sensation there that I have not been feeling ever. And in my last relationship, this is funny, I had this desire for him to suck on my nipples. But we did a podcast once where we were talking about overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And he came up with the title, like sucking from the mommy nipple, which is what an underfunctioner does in a relationship. And after he came up with that, I'm like, fuck, like, I can't ask him to suck on my nipples right now because he's underfunctioning. And then it becomes this more maternal thing than it is a sexual thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so now being single, I'm like, I can reclaim that with myself. And I have this beautiful toy that I can play with for now and really reclaim that sensual relationship with my breasts instead of it being like this more maternal, like I need to feed a child who, is not functioning to the degree that they need to be functioning, and they can't sustain themselves without my nourishment. And so now I get to pour that nourishment back into me and explore nipple pleasure and nipple orgasms. And I'm very excited to see where this next chapter of my life is going to take me.
I am totally intrigued. And I'm still like, it's possible to give yourself a cervical orgasm. Like I've had a G-spot orgasm with a few partners. And to me, it feels different from my clitoral orgasm in that it doesn't peak as high. It doesn't feel like it climbs it does climb, but it doesn't feel like it has this sharp, cathartic peak. It feels more like a rumbling, widening wave. It feels wider and broader. So I've had that experience. If I've ever given myself a G-spot orgasm, it wasn't a memorable experience like yours. I may not have. I think I have tried and just gave up and been like, I'll just go back to what feels really good and what I love. And so I've had the distinction between those kinds of orgasms, but I have no idea what a cervical orgasm would be like or how I might get there. Can you do that with a toy? Doesn't it have to be really deep? How is it different?
There's this cervical wand that I ordered and it's on its way to me, which that's what I'm going to use for the solo exploration, because like there's no way to reach it with just my fingers. And so it's this beautiful like serpent like wand, and it's a glass toy, and it has this round like bulbous end that you can either use that end to stimulate your cervix, or you can use the other end, which is a little bit more narrow, and start with that. I'm very excited for this adventure when it shows up. I'm sure all of the delivery people are like, this woman just keeps ordering sex toys to
dildos.
I'm like, yes, I want to have an entire wall of them, all of the sex toys. Got to build my collection here. So for the cervical orgasm, like using a wand of some kind is most ideal, because unless you have like very, very, very long fingers, chances are you're not going to be able to stimulate your cervix from like just the insertion of your fingers. I'll send you the link to the one that I got.
Even if you did, I don't think from the angle of your hands you would be able to. It doesn't seem like also, I mean, maybe it would be possible if you were being fisted, but it doesn't
Perhaps.
seem like it would be possible without some assistance from a cock-like device.
100%. 100%.
But you've had it with that partner, and so you know what it feels like. So you kind of know the kind of stimulation that you're seeking. I'm not sure I even know what it's like for my cervix to be stimulated. A lot of times when people go really deep, depending on their shape, it hurts.
Yeah, it's very true. And with that partner, he had a very big cock. And a lot of the time, like the angle that we would be at, it would hurt. And so we had to really play around in the angles that we were using. And it was a specific angle, and it wasn't quite missionary, but it was very similar to a missionary position where my hips were slightly elevated but not too high. And my hips felt safe to open, and so my knees were supported, so there was no strain on my hips. And it was a very, very slow and steady and gentle opening. Probably the slowest that I've ever had sex in my entire life. It was like this micro movement. And it was through the micro movement that there was an opening energetically with my cervix to be like, okay. Okay. But then it hasn't happened since. So that's why I'm so excited to explore it with myself and go in that very slow and gentle and intentional movement, and trust that like this could take many, many, many sessions, many months. Like who knows how long it's going to take for that part of my womb space to be de-armored enough to release and surrender me with me.
Yeah.
And it's such a personal experience, like, and it can be really painful when we're with a partner who's like hitting our cervix and at a certain angle or at a certain intensity that could be very, very painful. And to go slower and softer is where it's at for me. That's what's been helpful for me.
This episode was mixed and mastered by Irving Goddori, igrecording.com, on the interwebs. My cover art was illustrated by Shauna Shea, whom you can find on 99 Designs. The remix of my original intro music was created by Kid Mental, an a cappella beatbox musician and a Black creator you can support right now on Fiverr or patreon.com/kidmental. If you'd like one-on-one guidance from me on your intimate struggles, I now offer personal intimacy roadmap sessions, 60-minute sessions with a takeaway plan. In other words, sex-positive, judgment-free, compassionate support for what ails you in the realm of sex, love, and relationships of all kinds. To schedule, email lila@horizontalwithlila.com. And if you desire ongoing support of your intimate growth, you can join the $100 Patreon tier on patreon.com/horizontalwithlila and receive a 30-minute coaching session every month. In next week's Patrons Only episode with Kelsey, we delve into sex that disturbs the neighbors, wound mates and heart mates, the runner and the chaser, dating with intention, the fantasy of her former relationship, overfunctioning and underfunctioning, losing sexual desire, and whether wound mate relationships can ever become healthy. Until next time, may you have someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. I'm looking forward to the possibility of shibari. Thank you for listening. Thank you for getting horizontal. My lovers have never gone that slow with me for me to de-armor or to relax deeply enough to trust inside my vagina they weren't going to then get carried away and speed up